All right. Well, I think we're probably good to go ahead. We still have a good number of people getting logged in. I have a few administrative tasks to cover off the top, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Mark Leggett with Research Data Canada, and this is the first in what is a five-part webinar series that Research Data Canada is hosting on data ownership. So just to cover off a couple of administrative items. Just to make it easier for me, I'm going to be facilitating the panel conversation today, and I'm also going to be paying attention to the chat and the Q&A, but it would make my job a lot easier if people use the Q&A button, which is the third one from the right there on the black strip. So depending on which platform you're using, Windows or Mac, it may look a little different, but it should be a button at the bottom of your window labeled Q&A. So that makes it easier for me because I can queue them in the order that they're received, and I can also have them taken off the screen when they're answered. This event is also being recorded, so the recording will be available. Anybody who is registered will get an email as soon as that recording is available, and it will include the full audio. Since we're not really using a slide deck other than these introductory pieces, it'll be mostly the faces of our colleagues. Your name and questions you may ask in the Q&A panel or the chat are not recorded, so feel free to ask whatever questions come to mind. So that's it for the administrative piece. I will also highlight the other sessions that are coming before we start the panel. I did want to set a little bit of context. So as I said, this is the first in a five-part series on data ownership. And this is an informal conversation. You might think of it as an armchair conversation where our three colleagues are going to respond to questions. And I have a couple of questions queued up that I will use, but because I'm going to encourage as an informal conversation as possible to kind of live up to that armchair or fireside chat concept, I would really encourage you to put any comments or questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to insert those into the conversation as we move ahead. So I did want to kind of create the seed though by posing this question, which is one that I pose a lot, and that is, what would happen to discovery and innovation in society as a whole if all research outputs were publicly accessible tomorrow? So that the details of ownership and those kinds of things are the things that we're going to dive into over the next number of weeks. But to put that in a slightly different context, I'd like to also use this quote from Guy Rouleau, who's the director of the Montreal Neurological Institute, or the MNI, and also instrumental in the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute at McGill. And essentially what Guy is saying is that, we're committed to making the results of our research openly accessible from the get-go, because there's any number of people out there who have expertise similar to mine, but look at things very differently. And one of those people will potentially come up with something new that I wouldn't have thought of. So again, just to kind of provide that context, the other phrase that I like to use when thinking about research data and the kinds of activities that our colleagues will discuss today is ideally research data is as open as possible and as close as necessary. And I'll leave that with you as a phrase to consider as we have our conversation. And before I introduce our three panelists, and I'll show this slide again at the end, but these are the five parts for our series. Today's is the data ownership writ large. The second one is Indigenous data ownership. And then our third is the academic post-secondary context. We'll have colleagues from both the university and college sector. Standards and protocols that dive into a little more details of how you reflect data ownership and those kinds of provenance. And then the final one is a conversation about open science and open data in the broader context, and given the four that have come before. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and introduce our colleagues. And as I said, we have 3 colleagues today, so I'll just introduce each of them, and then I'll ask them to provide a few comments just to get us started. So Dr. Carolyn Cummins is currently an associate professor in the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto. She completed her undergraduate degree in chemistry at McGill and her PhD in pharmaceutical chemistry at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Cummins has been a recipient of an Early Researcher Award from the Government of Ontario, a New Investigator Award from CIHR, and several teaching awards. Her research is funded by CFI, CIHR, NSERC, and HSFC, and she has co-authored over 70 research publications and has 3 patents. Our second panelist is Martin Taylor. In 2016, April 2016, Martin began a 5-year term as the Executive Director of the Canadian Research Data Center Network, or the CRDCN, based out of McMaster University. He's a Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of Victoria and an Adjunct Professor at the School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster, and also an Adjunct at the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo. From 2007 to 12, Martin was the founding president and CEO of Ocean Networks Canada, certainly one of our larger and more richer and more complex research infrastructures. Prior to that, Martin was the University of Victoria's first Vice President of Research, and he has extensive experience in the governance and management of major research initiatives in Canada. Martin's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and is the author of 2 books and over 100 research publications. Finally, our third panelist is Lucy Guibault. Professor Guibault is the Associate Director of the Law and Technology Institute and Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University in Halifax. She joined the Schulich School of Law in 2017 after 20 years at the Institute of Information Law of the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And Lucy is a law graduate with an LLB and LLM from the Université de Montréal and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam. And through her in-depth study of various aspects of copyright licensing and her involvement in the Creative Commons Netherlands group, Lucy has developed a keen interest for all open access issues. She has given numerous presentations on the topic of law and open access. And from 2014 to 16, Lucy was a member of the Horizon 2020 Ad Hoc Expert Advisory Group on Science with and for Society, and the Expert Advisory Group on European Research Infrastructures to promote openness in the scientific research agenda. So with that, I am going to call on each of our panelists to maybe just 2 or 3 minutes of introductory remarks. So why don't we start with you, Carolyn?
Hey, thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and I am probably representing the basic scientists or the fundamental research aspects of data ownership. So that's my perspective that I'll be coming in from. I would characterize myself as an open science enthusiast, but not necessarily, like I still haven't fully adopted it, I would say, for my group. But I am very interested and I see potential there. About 10 years ago, I was exposed to the idea of open science and open drug discovery actually by Al Edwards, who gave a talk at U of T. And that's kind of where I was inspired from that time. It's the first time I'd heard of such a thing. And so from my field, my field is really molecular metabolism. I study diabetes and obesity and try to create new therapies for those diseases. From my field, it was really not a common thing to even present unpublished work at conferences and things like that. When I was coming through the ranks as a graduate student and postdoc. And I guess after I saw Al's talk and the tides were changing in terms of open science, I posted my first preprint on bioRxiv in 2016, and it was a great experience for me. It really provided some advantages as an early career researcher, having difficulty getting certain things past editors. It was a great thing for me. Then I sort of adopted it even more, and I've deposited more than one publication now on bioRxiv. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from, mindful of the fact, though, that I am also a drug discoverer. So my goal in my lab is to create new therapies. And I was educated with the idea that to do so, we need to protect the IP that we create. And so that's something that I struggle with.
All right, thanks, Carolyn. Martin, do you want to go next?
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks very much for the invitation to participate. It's a privilege to do that. I guess building on Carolyn's notion of perspective, I guess I bring three perspectives in part to this discussion. I mean, my one perspective would be my academic pedigree as a geographer, because in that regard, my work has been intrinsically interdisciplinary, and so open in that sense to the theory, methods and content of a variety of disciplines that impinge on what was my major area of research, which was environment and health. So in a way, the notion of open science and the data management associated with that comes quite naturally, I think, to some degree from that perspective. The second perspective is that, of course, having been a vice president of research, and interestingly, when I went to the University of Victoria in 1998, what was on my desk on day one was to create an intellectual property policy after failed attempts at that university to do just that. And that, after a few months of effort, materialized into actually a creator-owned policy, which has interesting elements in it, particularly picking up, I think, on your point and your phrase, Mark, in terms of as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Because one of the reasons that it was a creator-owned policy in the context of that particular university, and I don't want to generalize necessarily beyond that, was the particular view that was held by those in the arts and humanities, particularly the creative arts, around music, around visual art and so on, that they were creating, not necessarily in a laboratory, depending on publicly funded research, but in terms of their own creative abilities. And it was an interesting context to come into, particularly having moved from McMaster, where the context was really quite different. The third perspective, as you alluded to in the introduction, is having had the privilege of leading two of Canada's major science initiatives, one Ocean Networks Canada and the other, the Canadian Research Data Centre Network currently, and how different they are. Because Ocean Networks Canada, of course, deals essentially with non-human data. In other words, what's happening in the ocean, deep ocean, up through the water column right to the surface. And there, I mean, right from the very beginning, I mean, the whole notion, of course, was wiring the ocean for the public good and the public understanding in terms of how oceans are changing and the ways in which that data was critical to our understanding of essentially an unknown world, or a relatively unknown world that makes up 2/3 of our planet. And so right from the get-go, open data was a critical mandate and principle. That stands in an interesting comparison with where I am now, which is the Canadian Research Data Centre Network, where our raison d'etre is to handle the microdata, the confidential microdata, secure microdata, largely coming through our partnership with Statistics Canada. And so this is an interesting one where it does sit at that nexus between as open as possible and as closed as necessary, because the important caveat there, obviously, is to protect the confidentiality of human subject data. As it comes to us through variety of surveys, as it comes to us through administrative data that gets down to tax records and other things of that sort, as well as fairly detailed and important health data. So I'll stop there. I think that gives you a sense of the perspectives that I've enjoyed and hopefully inform some of the discussion we'll have. And again, thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Martin. Lucy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also for having me on this panel. I'm very honored to be in such good company. And as you all guess, my perspective is very legal. I first got interested in the entire open access movement by examining copyright licenses. And if you go back, you know, open access is rather recent, and we're still dealing with many publishers that enforce rather restrictive legal agreements with their authors, and libraries that need to pay more and more money to acquire those licenses. So this is, I think, the backdrop that spurred the open access movement. And once, you know, nowadays, we're 20 years, perhaps more than 20 years later, it's quite admitted or accepted in many fields of science to publish articles under open access conditions. But what happens to the data? You know, well, depending on the field that you're researching, under the articles, you often have very valuable research data. And so what is the status of that data? And that's, from a legal perspective, very interesting to study. You know, you have the ideology that if you make the article open access, you should also be consequent and also release the data underlying the conclusions in the article for verifiability, reproducibility, and also to allow you know, all the advantages that we'll be speaking during the panel. But so there are particular issues regarding data that are different from the legal issues regarding articles. So that's also interesting in itself. And so this is, I think, what we'll be discussing together. Privacy is one issue, and IP law is also one issue. So this is the basis of my interests in open access, because as you had put up in your first slide, imagine a world where all the research is freely available. Well, what would happen? I hope sincerely that knowledge would circulate much better, and that we would find solutions to big problems much easier.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So with that as our kind of backdrop and a bit of a better sense of who each of our three panelists is, I'll pose the first question, and I'll maybe ask Martin to respond to this one first. So in my conversations with researchers in particular, I often use the term gentle tension to describe the benefits that can be achieved from both the personal context or the personal good that comes from, for example, scholarly research and the production of research outputs, versus the public good that can come from data sharing and all the things that we've had some initial comments on. Can we effectively remove this tension in order to share research data more broadly? And one need nothing but the current COVID-19 context, I think, to consider this question. Can we remove that tension in order to share research data more broadly? And if so, is there one key step that you would consider as key to getting there? Martin?
Okay, well, thanks, Mark. I guess I start from a premise, and that premise would be that certainly in the academy, in the university research community, for most of us, research data is primarily the result of public funding for the public good, and by definition, therefore, should belong in the public domain. I mean, I think that's, you know, my starting position, recognizing that there are caveats associated with that, but that certainly strongly influences the way that I think. And I guess I've got three thoughts around the question you've asked, Mark. I mean, one is, first of all, thinking about where our funding agencies are coming from on this issue. And as you know, there is a current draft Tri-Council policy on research data management that obviously has some elements of what we're talking about today. And I do think that's important because leadership through the councils matters, both in terms, I would suggest, of shaping values, somewhat linked obviously to the premise I've just stated, but also in terms of setting expectations, both at the level of our institutions and at the level of individual researchers and research teams. So I do think when you ask, is there one key step to getting closer to a shared understanding of these issues that we're talking about around data management and data ownership and open science, where the Tri-Councils sit obviously is a very important ingredient there and component there. The second comment I would make is harmonizing standards. And this is a really tricky one in a number of areas of science. And I come at this again, obviously from my own personal experience to a certain degree. And one thinks about that particularly from my oceans experience. I mean, what was surprising to me, I must admit, having not been an oceanographer by training, but coming into Ocean Networks Canada in a leadership position, recognizing the fact that as we were wiring the oceans off the West Coast and wanting to measure lots of different things and thereby make international comparisons and contribute to an international knowledge of the ocean, how basic parameters related to ocean chemistry, ocean physics, ocean biology were not necessarily being measured in the same way in different jurisdictions, and how that complicates open science and data management when you can't make those comparisons. And then I want to bring that particular issue home with force now in the Canadian context. And it applies to the work that we as a Canadian Research Data Centre Network are doing around health. I mean, one of the limiting conditions, and we've seen it so starkly around COVID, is the fact that we do not have necessarily standard accepted measures for our data on health in this country, and largely because it's provincially jurisdiction. And so when it comes even to assessing the level of impact and the incidence and prevalence of COVID and how one deals with it, you don't have necessarily standards across the country. And so you're making somewhat apples and oranges comparisons on an almost daily basis to determine what's happening where. So the lack of harmonized standards, I think, is a complicating factor. And the third one, comment on this one would be, though, I guess a more positive one, is that team research, Carolyn and Lucy, I'm sure, can speak to this as well from their perspectives, is becoming so prevalent now and so important to address some of the biggest questions that we're trying to answer, whatever our field is. And I think that team research, which often, of course, extends to international research, it's not just national, is, I think, a real impetus for a more open approach to science and to data management. And I'll stop there, and thank you.
All right, thanks, Martin. And I'm going to, Lucy, ask you for your thoughts on that gentle tension question, but I'm also going to introduce a little curveball, because one of our attendees has said, I thought data weren't copyrightable, and how does that relate to ownership? So, and I'm pulling that in here for you, Lucy, I think for obvious reasons, but also because I think that's one of the more common kind of comments or thoughts about data, is that it's not copyrightable, therefore it's kind of publicly accessible, or should be. So any thoughts on the question and that?
Of course. So indeed, that raw data is not copyrightable because copyright protects expressions of ideas and not the ideas themselves. So it's absolutely correct. So where's the problem? Well, the problem is if you're the sole producer of a set of data, then it's a bit like the chicken on the golden egg. If you're the sole producer and you have the possession, and you haven't released that data anywhere, you possess it or you own it as you would own something else, but it doesn't mean that there's an IP right on it. So it's it's the tension between property on a good that is secret and an IP right on it. So it's a matter of policy also. How do you, how one will exercise their rights on their data. So to protect the data, they could not invoke copyright or any other IP right on the data. They can only keep it secret, which goes counter to all the values that we're trying to vehicle here in this conversation. So there should be, so, you know, going back to the tension and going back to what Barton has presented, I think that the tri-council policy is key indeed. And I think that the tri-council policy is very good, but it should also go further than just at the top level. It should also include institutions. So institutions, all the universities and the research centers should also embrace the open access philosophy, because they will be the ones who will cater for the incentives for the researchers below, right? So why would researchers have the incentive to release their data if they're like the chicken and the golden egg? Well, it would be because there's an incentive out there, and you have different kinds of incentives. It can be promotion, or it can be altruism. It can be recognition in your field. So many kinds, but if it's promotion in one's career, then the institution is the one to make sure that recognition will be given for the release of the data under open access conditions. So yes, so there's no IP right on that, correct? And it's only a matter of choosing between secrecy or openness.
Yeah, great response, Lucy. It's that institutional role in this fabric, I think, is a critical one, and so it's an important point you raised there. Carolyn, any thoughts on the gentle tension question?
Yeah, I think it changes also depending on what stage of career you're at. So, like in my group, like I remember being a PhD student, and I was like devastated when a paper came out that I thought scooped me. And my PI was, wasn't fussed in the least bit about it, and said, there's always something different. There's always something new. Don't worry about it. And now that I'm a PI, I have a student who just came to me today with the same concern, and I can appreciate exactly how she feels, because I was once her. But now I'm on the other side where I don't, my value or my education or what I need to advance to the next step is not tied to that one publication. Mm-hmm. And therefore I can have a more relaxed view. And so I think, I don't know how we change that so that, because I think what we need to do is change the incentives at the very beginning of our education. And that way, as we go through, progress, we're more open to begin with. It's not something that we have to grow into. It's something that we've been our whole time through the academy or whatever.
And
anyway.
You raised, where you are in your career, you raised an interesting issue. And we have a question from one of the attendees that addresses it from a slightly different point of view, which, would releasing data as open data disadvantage an unfunded researcher, let's say, from a small university who has a breadth of roles and responsibilities, as they often do in small universities, and therefore it often takes a long time to publish. And so there's the timeline question, but more from the, is there an appropriate time period at which one should be expected to release data, given those kinds of challenges? Any thoughts on that from any of you?
Well, I mean, it is reciprocal, right? I mean, so, I mean, if you're, I mean, on the one hand, you can say that, you know, releasing your data is taking a risk because you're losing proprietary rights. But if the reciprocal is that you're getting access to others' data, then presumably there is a counterpoint to the negative.
Right.
It's a type of network effect. The more people play, the more advantage there are.
Exactly.
And to go back also to one remark that Martin made, international research is so prominent these days. And if you look at what's going on in Europe, the European Commission is only funding open access and open science. Even the whole scientific endeavor now is geared towards openness from beginning to end, to include all levels of research, including society. So if we want to play with European partners, for example, I think there's a definite incentive to also release the data that we develop.
Yeah, indeed.
Another element here, just prompted a little bit by Lucy's comment, Mark, is how this varies by discipline. And, you know, when you look at big science, and one thinks, you know, for example, of subatomic and particle physics, that would use a facility like CERN, you know, you look at the raft of authors, international team authors who are on those papers, and the accreditation and credit that's associated with, you know, being part of that team within the physics community, even if you're one of 50, right, can count more than being one of one, no, in another context. So I think the points that both Lucy and Karen are making are vital ones in terms of it is very contextual, both in terms of stage of career, but also in terms of disciplinary traditions, expectations, dependence on facilities, and so on. So many variables that enter in here.
And another comment that segues nicely with the second question. So the question, then I'll kind of tie it into one of the comments. So the question is, how do we reconcile, and we've touched on this with a couple of our comments, how do we reconcile the norms represented by traditional forms of IT, patents, copyright, etc., with the desire to more broadly share research data? So that's the question. And one of our colleagues has commented that they themselves hear from colleagues at their institution that the tenure and promotion committee at that institution gives more weight to publications than to data. In fact, they would ignore the release of data, is the comment. So their focus is on publishing as many papers as they can, and therefore they don't have time, or their, you know, the incentive to share their data is less. So there's that kind of aspect to the question about how do we reconcile the norms, and one of those norms is tenure and promotion committees. So Lucy, do you want to go ahead?
Well, yes, I want to jump in here because this is exactly what I was relating to in my first comment, saying that the institutions play a definite role in the whole process, especially in the tenure promotion process, because if they don't acknowledge or give any weight to the release of data, then they contribute to stopping, basically, to putting barriers to the circulation and distribution of precious data to the benefit of everyone. So institutions, to me, have the duty eventually, or sooner rather than later, to develop new norms for tenure and promotion to take advantage or to take account of the release of data. I don't know if Carolyn or Martin want to.
I 100% agree with you, Lucy. But having been through the tenure and promotion process and knowing the angst that goes along with that, you know, not that long ago, as a junior faculty, you know who's on that committee, and they are all senior faculty, full professors who got through the process in a completely different way than you did. But
sorry to interrupt, but this perpetuates the difficulties. It's a self-perpetuating fallacy, and that needs to be broken. So somebody somewhere in those institutions need to set new rules to say, even if we're dealing with older faculty member judging junior faculty members, they need to get new directives to say, well, from now on, we need to take care or take account of the whole research process and the release of data. So I don't want this to be self-replicating all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the
I
question
agree
is,
with you.
who are the leaders and who are the followers, right? I mean, I
Correct.
think this becomes a critical question because what we're talking about is the mismatch between rhetoric and reality.
Yes.
I mean, there is a lot of rhetoric around open science and various forms of data sharing, and there's a lot of it happening. So it's not just rhetoric at that level, but I think we're touching on a very critical point in terms of reality, and that is the processes that are still largely in place, and universities playing catch up, if you want to call it that, in terms of then how the principles that are enshrined within open data and data sharing and so forth are then translated into the policies and procedures at the university, at the institutional level. And I mean, this is where it comes down to, I think, wise leadership, quite frankly. And part of that is at the level we talked about earlier in terms of where the tri-councils provide leadership and thereby provide incentives in terms of funding mechanisms and criteria for evaluating work. But it comes down to wise leadership in the institutions as well, right? I mean, it really does. And having been a vice president research, I'm very conscious of that. And it really does, I think, become increasingly incumbent now on our universities to look all the more at their policies and procedures in the context as the world is changing. And it's changing for good reasons, I think, around the issues we're talking about today. But there cannot be a disjuncture between those changes, that evolution, and the policies and procedures in play and in place across our system.
Yeah, somebody who was a senior administrator in universities for a couple of decades. I sat on promotion and tenure committees for 28 to 25 years, and the conversations are certainly an opportunity to change the culture and accept different norms, and as Lucy and others have suggested, show leadership in moving forward in this context. So I certainly don't think that our traditional approaches, for example, in a tenure promotion committee context, need hold things back. But it is a cultural change that has to be deliberate and long term. I'm just going to go to a couple of the comments and questions in our Q&A before I go to what in our list was the fourth question. That's the last question for the panel. One question here is, so if raw data isn't copyrightable, can a curated data set be eligible?
Sorry?
Can a curated data set, or a data set that has added value in terms of documentation and the kinds of things that you use to enhance data in a curation role, does that make it copyrighted?
Well, it would have to be determined on a case-by-case basis. So the requirement under Canadian law is that a database or a collection of data show sufficient skill and judgment in their selection and arrangement, which in other country would be creativity, originality, stamp of the author's intellectual effort. So it varies per country, but originality in Canada is examined from the skill and judgment criteria. And depending what you do, how you curate the collection, but if the threshold is not very high, but it's not also not that low. So it's not just skill and labor. Just putting effort in it would not be sufficient. You would need to exercise judgment and skill in the choices that you make to present the data. And in science, this doesn't really sound like something that would reach the threshold.
Okay. Here's a comment that I think was sparked by Martin's comment about the physics papers with large numbers of authors. So this individual works at a small university, but in the area of subatomic physics with large international collaborations, just as Martin suggested. The idea of a team, again, coming to Martin's comments, is more important than data ownership. However, making the data from the research open is difficult and potentially even dangerous, given the nature of the science. It is only interpretable with proprietary knowledge contained within the collaboration itself, about in the context of the equipment and the facility itself. So the question is, how much complex and involved data can be made open, or should it be? Does Carolyn or Martin, or it's gets at
go ahead, you go ahead, Carolyn. Go ahead.
I guess I go to the principles that we talk about, the FAIR principles, that they findable, accessible, and then I forget what the I stands for, but it's basically that you can use that information in the sense that's interpretable broadly. And I don't know in the physics realm, but certainly in my field, the medical sort of sciences, we have special repositories for different types of data, like proteomics data, microarray data, or RNA-seq data. And those allow us to put the raw data in a way that the users are going to be able to mine it on their own. So I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I don't think data is actually that useful if you don't have a way to analyze it or interpret it or even open it properly, I guess.
Well, you do raise an important point, Carolyn, maybe just to jump in, but the FAIR principles, the I is interoperable, were designed to ensure that the existence of data can be known, and therefore there can, whether it's made openly available or there's a communications pipeline to the individual or individuals who have ownership or control of that data. So the FAIR principles don't say your data must be open. They say it should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that's a very important kind of nuance that's been introduced into the conversation over the last couple of years to encourage all data to be findable, but not necessarily downloadable immediately, and especially not without the proper documentation and context and all the rest. So that's certainly an important concept to be raised.
So Mark, maybe where that question was going, and I could be misunderstanding it, but is the potential misuse or misinterpretation of data by those who aren't close to the action initially. And that's a very valid concern. That said, I mean, clearly there are a few people who are going to jump into subatomic or particle physics data who aren't fairly close to the action, I suspect. But leaving that aside, there is another dimension to this which I think is important, and that is, while we have, I think, very good structures and procedures in place through peer review and so on, as checks and balances for what's good science and what isn't, using data that may or may not be data that I created in the first place, where it becomes, I think, more difficult, and we're seeing it every day in one form or another, of course, is when it moves out of the research domain into the policy domain, right? And where it's interpretations of data for then policy use. And of course, climate change is probably the classic example of that, varying interpretations of data that's generally in the public domain and then gets politicized by reason of ideological persuasion to then say one thing or another. And that's a little bit beyond the realm, I know, of this particular conversation, but it's actually a very interesting one in the context of government science. And you will recall, of course, how unopen government science was a few years ago, and the deliberate attempt that this government, federal government, has taken to open it up. And the chief science advisor, Mona Nima, of course, being in the forefront of trying to advance that cause, and rightly so. But it does, of course, take us into this dimension of that being then at the kind of interface between more basic research and the applications of that research in the policy domain. And that's where it does get a bit tricky, I have to say.
Yeah. Maybe just to insert a comment related to some of our previous conversation, one of our attendees, says that the issues of property and ownership are important, but he wonders if the attribution and authorship are more appropriate in this dynamic of open science and the free flow of knowledge. Anybody want to comment on that all important aspect of attribution and authorship?
Well, I wouldn't refer to authorship in the context of raw data, because we talk about authorship in the context of copyrighted material. If raw data is not copyrighted, I would not talk about authorship. But anyway, attribution, I think, is a very important factor in the tenure and promotion process. So if there's one incentive to release all the data, it's because you will get attributed at some point. If somebody else uses your data set somewhere, it's key. It's just the same as getting cited from your publication. So yes, I think that releasing data should carry with it the obligation to give attribution when it's being reused by anyone else.
So there's a number of other questions, but I'm just going to pose the last question, and then we'll come back to some of the others. So the last question is we've all heard this phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. To me, it's another way of describing the philosophy of open science, and that is that we can't advance without the advances that came before us. So can we continue to stand on the shoulders of those who have come before us and even improve upon it by embracing open science and research? So I just want to kind of put that out there as one of the kind of final conversations we can have as we come towards the end. So any comments on that while I look through the other questions in our Q&A?
Go ahead, Martin.
No, you go ahead. I'm always interrupting you, so you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that from the perspective of science, like science advances on our predecessors' findings, for sure. Open science, however, I think is something that we need to increase our education on. And that's, I think, something we can do at a university level, even maybe start earlier and try to promote this at the high school level, thinking about how we want to share things so that it's ingrained early. Because I think by the time you get to graduate school or post-grad, it almost takes like a revolutionary change in your thinking to be able to go that route. So I think education about open science, the benefits, successful examples of how it has really changed the way we do things or how we look at different problems, those all need to be part of the narrative that scientists get throughout their career, I think.
I think there's an organizational piece to this too. It's interesting, I think, to look at the history of our national academies of science and the roles that they have played, and a little bit of a concern, I think, and it's not just in Canada, maybe it's not as much in Canada as elsewhere, in terms of the erosion of the prominence of the national academies of science, and the fact that the younger generation has perhaps not bought in to the Royal Societies or their equivalents around the world in the way they would. And and one side of that is they can be a little elitist sometimes, but leaving that aside, I do think, again, coming back to the notion of wise leadership, those academies are important in terms of these issues. Where does our Royal Society sit? Where does the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and the equivalent in other disciplinary areas come into play here? But the other point I wanted to make on this one at an organizational level in terms of innovative leadership, and I think Canada's been particularly good in this, is creating organizations like the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, where you've got an organization under terrific leadership, I have to say, that has promoted the best in terms of bringing Canadian scholars together with international scholars to address big issues, not only for science and for research more broadly, but indeed for society. And where open data and open science becomes, I think, a critical component of advancing that kind of work. You know, in the brain research area, in artificial intelligence, in mental health, etc., where CIFAR, just to use that one example, I think has been particularly progressive in the ways of thinking. So I do think there is, again, I'm coming back, I think, to I guess a favorite theme of mine, which is wise leadership. And I think that wise leadership can come at an organizational level, perhaps through some renaissance of the academies of science, but also through organizations like CIFAR.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to, and as I've heard you speak about leadership in many contexts, Martin, and I think that's a very critical part of this this equation. One comment we have is, I wonder if sharing to a data commons that would allow researchers to receive track academic citations may move the dial on individual researchers' incentives to share data, as well as the institution's views on the importance of sharing data.
Absolutely.
So that's just a comment, and I think it highlights the importance of some of these infrastructures that we are building. It's an interesting question posed here. When should we know when to withdraw open data that turns out to be noisy, biased, or mismeasured or wrong? Brings to mind the process of retractions of articles. Leaving them open may harm the public good we're looking for. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, if I may, I think there should be clear procedures on the websites of the repositories of the data to cater for the possibility to have withdrawals or retractions. And I think the procedure should be transparent and clear to allow for this to happen. And I think it is important. So Martin, you wanted to add something?
No, I'm just coming in behind you, Lucy. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so what's the equivalent of the editorial board, right? I mean, it is one way of thinking about it. I mean, it's peer review, I agree, but one element of that is an editorial board, but whatever that would translate into in terms of the custodians and oversight of a data bank or of some sort. So I'm sure those exist. I mean, I can't quote them left, right, and centre, but that certainly should go alongside, I think, what we're discussing in terms of developing open data of the sort that is the focus today.
A bit like a notice and takedown procedure. It should be balanced as well, because you don't want to take down data sets abusively.
Yes.
So you would need to have a process, and that process should be clear and transparent.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a fair number of questions here. I'm going to hopefully be able to respond to some of them offline. One interesting one that I hadn't thought about in too much was, what about research data that's generated by a machine learning or synthetic data that's kind of machine generated? How does that factor into this landscape of data ownership or open data? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there's a whole discussion at the World Intellectual Property Organization currently, and also at the OECD, discussing all these issues. These are upcoming issues with which the law is still a bit behind. So all policymakers, lawmakers, scholars are now giving thoughts to, should there be ownership rights attributed to such creations or not, and who should be designated as the owner or the author. These are intricate issues, and I don't think that the legal community is out yet with an opinion on the way to proceed, because any decision on this needs to meet the fundamental objectives of the copyright regime or the patent regime. The issue also arises in should computer-generated inventions also be patentable? So, but you know, if it meets the criteria for patentability, perhaps, but who is the inventor? So the current Western IP regimes always needed a creator or an inventor behind it to award the rights, and that issue is very difficult at this point.
A difficult and fascinating conversation, the bits that I've read. So we're clearly not going to be able to have an opportunity to respond to everyone's question. However, I will make a record of some of them here, and we'll make an effort to get back to folks to see if they would like an appropriate response. I did want to leave just a couple of minutes for closing remarks from each of our panelists. It's been a very engaging conversation, and given the number of questions and comments we had in the Q&A, I think it's I think it bodes well for the next 4 series in the webinars in the series. So thanks to the 3 of you for participating today. I'll just go in the order I see on the screen here, and each of you for final comments. Martin?
Well, I think you know, the phrase that you gave us at the beginning, while it's a little bit fence-sitting in some respects, is still a pretty good one for many of the areas that, you know, our collective responsibilities cover, namely as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I mean, I think there are limits here, and I think we've touched on where some of those limits lie in terms of data that are by their very nature confidential and need to be secure and protected, and I don't think we can disregard that. I do think we didn't get to it, but I do think some of the IP-driven mentality of the past is a little bit misplaced. I think, you know, as we had a prior conversation about this session, you know, I used the phrase "the myth of the millions," namely, you know, protecting IP because we think we're going to make a fortune out of it is a very rare event. I mean, it does happen. I mean, I'm not denying that. But I think that revenue generation thing maybe can be exaggerated. But the last thing I would say is also when we think about, you know, the more financial aspects, we should not only think about revenue generation, we should also think about the other side of the ledger, which is expense reduction. And, you know, I'll go to my oceans example and finish with this. I mean, the very fact that, you know, using that Kaywood Ocean Observatory off the West Coast and generating early warning data on tsunami and seismic activity, you know, in an open data context, you know, has huge implications in terms of the economic benefit of publicly available information. Not because it's making money, it's saving money. And that's a huge piece, with it being, of course, the biggest single risk to life, livelihood, and property on the West Coast.
Yeah, and we're going through a different kind of example of that right now.
Exactly, huge one.
Lucy?
Well, I just also want to jump in on this. It reduces costs, but it also avoids unnecessary duplication of work.
Absolutely.
So if you release your data, other teams may just avoid going down the same path if it's not necessary, or repeating unnecessary work. But what I also wanted to say is that the standing on the shoulders of giants may not be the same giants that we have in mind. If we release data, we enable anyone out there to create or to invent or to continue building on innovation. And it may or may not be a scientist in a research lab, but it may also be someone in the public. It may be somewhere on the other side of the planet. And that's all good. We need to encourage society to take part in technological change and innovation, to go along with it, to benefit from it. And I think that releasing the data for those who can interpret it and you go and use it is key in this movement.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Right.
Lucy. Final word to you, Carolyn.
I guess I'd just add that I think, as I mentioned before, I think educating people about alternative methods of creating, let's say in my world, medicines that don't go through the traditional IP route would be so useful for our trainees, because we go through and they take courses on, you know, business and how to translate your finding to the clinic, and they all go through the exact same pathway, and that pathway is not open. So we really need to do a better job, and I am committed to it. I need examples, but I'm willing to create some educational programs to try to get us thinking with the mindset of being more open from an earlier stage.
Well, thanks for that, Carolyn. It's a good way to end the conversation. I should also add that you and I had our very first conversation when we met each other virtually around the topic of open science, and so I appreciate that conversation that we had, and to you and Lucy and Martin for taking the time to take part in the panel today. And I'll also like to thank, obviously, all of our participants for taking part today. I did just put the link in the chat where you can get more information on the next 4 webinars. As I mentioned at the top, our next part 2 of the series is on Indigenous data sovereignty and ownership. And we have a number of great panelists on that one as well. So please, again, thanks for attending, and please consider signing up for the rest. And I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks
Thank you
all.
very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.